Cloud Foundry After Dark. The crazies are out. We're here. We had a bunch of stuff go on this week. We missed last week because I was traipsing around Europe. I went to Monkey Draw in London, and then POSM in Belgium, and then Configuration Management Camp. But a bunch of other stuff happened as well. We had a press release. James, you want to talk about our press release?
Well, it wasn't as important as the press release. It was also the write-up that Matt Acey did afterwards, saying he's been hanging around in open source for a long time. He was COO of Canonical.
Well, you know how fond I am of press releases.
He was COO of Canonical, and he was, very senior at MongoDB. He was there at Novell when they first started selling Linux support. And he's covered.
When I first met him, he was at Alfresco doing the open source thing there.
I did Alfresco. So Matt has been at like every open source company that matters or talked to the people there. And when we shared our results with him that we had in our first year of Pivotal CF, he was like, "It's never happened before. Never ever happened before." And so we're like, "Shoot, I think it's history. We definitely need to get the numbers out then." And I went on a little campaign. Well, it started with like, I asked Matt, I was like, "Hey, has this ever happened in history before and around these numbers?" And he's like, "No, dude, never." And I'm like, "I'm pretty sure." And I went out and I looked up Red Hat's first year, which was like 4 million, and Hortonworks' first year, which was like 4 million. And I was like, we're an order of magnitude bigger in our first year results than any open source company ever that anyone I can decipher has had. So we came out and we told that to the world, and part of it for me was just, I think it's a big change because open source has usually been the domain of bootstrapped companies and very small initiatives, and I think Cloud Foundry, as we've said before, is the first time someone pre-invested hundreds of millions of dollars into something and then launched it as a company. So I wanted the news to be out there so others could understand this is a viable model, and that over time more and more of all of enterprise software could become open source in that way.
Well, I think it's worth adding that it's one thing to look at our numbers at Pivotal, but you also have this other ecosystem, and there's other people that are making money off Cloud Foundry, and I expect even more will.
Yeah, that didn't include, ActiveState spoke up and said, "Hey, we made some money last year." IBM has Bluemix. And then, there's NE9s over there. There's also startups related to Cloud Foundry like Cloud Credo, etc. But, on a pure product basis, it was pretty amazing to be able to tell that story. And the funny thing is that a lot of people didn't even believe it. Like, it was so big, and it was an order of magnitude bigger than anyone ever seen before, that they were like...
We still don't believe it.
There's people who just don't believe it. Like, they're like, "Oh, well, that's something else." Well, I'm here to tell you, like, may my house catch on fire if that wasn't 100% Pivotal Cloud Foundry, brand new revenue, no ELA stuffing, just leaving it on the ice, kind of hard competitive evangelism all last year. And people thought it was a transformative product, and they wanted it for their internally, and they stepped up.
Well, it's just the beginning. We haven't even actually started.
Yeah, and I think what made it so big in dollar terms is we cracked the very high end. So, 4 out of the 5 top telcos in the country are Pivotal Cloud Foundry enabled now. 2 out of the top 3 insurance companies, and a couple of the smaller ones are. We got pilots in 3 of the top 5 financial institutions in the world right now, and they're headed our way. So I think that was what made it such a historically unique result, which is that we almost started at the top because we'd invested so much in R&D to help that use case. So anyway, that was pretty fun, and I need to get around to writing a blog post about it to give a little bit more detail.
Well, to be fair, and I mean, this whole thing, the project, if you know the history, it was worked on and invested on inside of VMware for years before it even saw the light of day.
Yeah, I mean, it was an open R&D model where normally you would have had 3 years of closed R&D and then a product launch, right? And then it would have had its first year. And I think for better or for worse, Cloud Foundry was one of the first open source and open R&D models. And it's hard once you talk about something to not also be selling it, because people expect to have some sort of, market adoption in terms of paid customers when you talk about something for years. But we essentially did R&D out in the open, and I think that helped us build a really big ecosystem. But when we finally did decide it was ready to go, it was ready to go.
Well, it's also interesting, at least from my perspective, to see a bunch of people and organizations that adopted the earlier versions of Cloud Foundry and where they're at. And some of them are running thousands of instances in production, but then how do they get back to the mainline upstream?
Well, we can't ever do a V1 to V2 again. I hope, James Bear. I hope you're listening to me. Right? Like that like giant schema changing everything different API, CLI, internal guts swap out from V1 to V2. I don't think we'll ever do that again. And Diego's coming right now, and it's much more evolutionary.
Well, and just to pile onto that, we started the V3 API already, but it's a very incremental approach where the process types work we're doing to become basically enable people to use the same application bits that they have with other types of processes, so you could have the same code base used for a web app and a worker app and an admin app. That whole part of the API is coming in under a V3, and the existing V2 will go along at the same side. So you'll see us just like gradually bring things over to the V3 API. So it'll be like a very incremental approach compared to the very disruptive V1 to V2 jump that we made. We will learn that lesson the hard way.
Yeah, we won't do that again. But that's part of what happens when you do open R&D, though, is that normally you would have not have released your V1 product yet. That would have been a rewrite that happened behind closed doors. Instead,
exactly.
We were full Monty. We were like, hey, here we are, going from prototype to production in front of the world.
So just for the history and for the viewers at home, maybe it's worth talking a tiny bit about that transition and some of the lessons we learned.
Between V1 and V2?
Yeah. Like, what were the choices or the things that had to be changed that made it so that there was this, schema breaking API change?
Well, I think the very first version of Cloud Foundry didn't have it was very focused on individual developer productivity, and so when you had that magical first experience of, and I still remember this when Cloud Foundry was launched. I was working at Oracle at the time on WebLogic, and I saw the CF push experience with those different 3 different languages with Ruby, Node, and Java right out of the box. I'm like, holy cow, that's really cool. And that experience of getting really on-demand services for an individual developer, getting those 3 different application frameworks running right away, was really, really differentiated at the time. It was revolutionary in and of itself. But then what we found when people actually wanted to take their apps that they were running in V1 and try and use them in production, it's like, oh boy, we haven't really thought about how this applies to enterprise constraints around team development, because everyone was sharing logins, and it was difficult to audit things like that. So the V2 API was really about introducing a bunch of enterprise concepts around orgs and spaces, so we can have this more of a hierarchical arrangement that represents really what modern enterprise development is actually like in the real world, as opposed to being focused on the individual developer.
And it introduced Warden on the DEA side. And and they took an opportunity to rewrite the cloud controller.
Yeah, there was definitely a technical aspect to it as well, where we removed a lot of single points of failure. We re-implemented a lot of troublesome parts of the architecture and various components. So there was kind of the conceptual change in additive capabilities, as well as fundamental technology changes under the covers that just basically learned lessons from the V1 code base that we had to get right. Yeah,
so I was there for that transition as well, and I'll share kind of my my initial experiences. So when I started with Cloud Foundry, I was still working in the EMC CTO office, kind of doing emerging tech, and the emerging tech that I was looking at was Cloud Foundry, and it was V1, and kind of the first thing that I wanted to do after I did the initial push was I wanted to see, well, okay, if I want to change my runtime, I don't want to use one of the built-in runtime environments, I want to change it to something else, I want to use a different language. Or if I want a different set of services, let's say I want an XML database at the back end. I know. Let's just say, humor me for a moment, and let's just say an XML database is cool.
Isn't that just a file system?
But what you had to do back then, if you wanted to do either one of those things in version 1, was your only option was to fork and extend. And everybody knows that fork and extend, you all of a sudden you've got the pain of constant merges back and things like that. So one of the big things that happened from V1 to V2 was we started looking at that and saying, look, people are going to want to make this their own. In the enterprise, they are going to have their XML databases or their time series databases or their homegrown things that they want to bring brokers for, service brokers for, or they're going to have their own flavor of Java. They're going to have their own things that they want to include as a part of the runtime environment. And so we really need to enable those hook points. And so part of the big transition from V1 to V2 was to go from a model of fork and extend to a model of inserting additional capabilities, inserting additional service brokers, inserting additional build packs. I mean, that's when build packs came. V1 didn't have build packs.
V2 didn't have build packs at first either, but a guy named Matthew Coker from Pivotal, who now leads engineering, he did a pilot where he's like, look how easily I could add build packs and it'd be much more extensible. That's what Pivotal Labs engineering was much more used to working with. That was the first big Pivotal Labs change to make it more pluggable and extensible. And I remember Derek Collison argued violently that runtime environments should not be pluggable and easily extensible. And I always, me and others, always sort of disagreed with him about that. He's like, oh, it should be very high quality. But if you look at how polyglot things are, etc., I do think that we should be opinionated about a couple, but they have to be extensible. So,
what was his main argument?
His main argument is that you didn't want the average developer implementing it. So it's not dissimilar to the discussion we have today about just pushing a Docker container to a PaaS. Like, this is not for, don't try this at home to fully implement language support, right? And so in the continuum between bring your own Docker container, Derek was very into proprietary staging elements that only the platform control people managed. And if you look at things like App Engine, where it came from at Google, they don't allow you to do pluggable runtime at all. In fact, they're the most opinionated on runtime. So he was becoming more liberal, becoming polyglot, kind of open, coming to CF. So it's a pretty big spectrum.
But you see what the thing is that our plug points aren't necessarily intended for the developer at all. And so most of the enterprises that I talk to, they don't want to allow their developers to bring their own build pack. They want to be able to customize the build pack. So it isn't just any developer willy-nilly changing things like they can do with Docker containers today. It's an enterprise making a very calculated and very careful decision on what my okay runtime environments are. And they can still be very polyglot and very varied, but they're very specific to that company.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think, it was a crazy story of 3 years of R&D out in the open for everyone to criticize, to love, or to hate. And that's why it was really special for me to be able to, the EMC gave us the permission to come out and put our financial results out there, that we'd put up those numbers, because it was an interesting journey. And in the end, the decisions collectively amounted to making open source history, which it's pretty cool. A lot of people on the team came up to me like, was that true? Are we really the fastest and biggest ever? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. Not even close. So, lots of decisions made along the way, though.
So we have a person who I've seen respond on Twitter before, and so I know he's watched some of the episodes, but if you want to say anything, hey, Steven, want to say hi, or you have anything on your mind?
He's muted.
So one of the reasons I joined is I did have a question. I sent it to you directly, James. I was kind of interested in the difference between the VMware version that they offer as a service and what the open source one is.
So like Pivotal Cloud Foundry versus open source Cloud Foundry differences?
Right.
Yeah. There's really only there's three differences. The first and the most important one is that BOSH is a relatively difficult operations tool to learn, and I'd love to have Andrew talk a little bit about his config management camp presentation on that. And one of the reasons is that there's relatively big manifests inside of BOSH that you have to generate and configure yourself. So in our enterprise version, we auto-generate some of that configuration for you so that you can just go through and say, hey, I want small, medium, large, I want this many nodes, go. And it saves you a little bit of expertise and learning curve. You know, I actually still personally, I still actually like BOSH in and of itself, and if I was running Cloud Foundry, I might actually just want my team to use BOSH directly. I think there's a lot of benefits to that, so it's not like it's a bad feature, but for enterprises that don't want to tolerate that learning curve, we do automatic BOSH configuration in the enterprise product. That's really the only big material difference, because the other two are that we provide a developer console that gives you a nice GUI, and it's a good portal for teams to use. And then we have some of our own services. But a vast majority of Cloud Foundry is very much open source. So if you want to know, what runs our service, you can pretty much check out the version that's running on pivotalwebservices.com or run.pivotal.io, our Pivotal Web Services, and we publish the bits that are running that service every week with a major release. And Bear can tell you a little bit more about it, but we really do try to have as much open source as we can, and still, fund 250 engineers.
Yeah, I think another interesting way to frame that question is if you look at there's a blog post that some people did last week from Pivotal and the mobile services team of when the Super Bowl came out. They spent about a day putting together a solution with Spring XD, Pivotal CF, RabbitMQ, and a little bit of the mobile stuff they're working on. And they put together a really cool analytics dashboard showing the different tweets. They took the Twitter fire hose and did a bunch of analytics on that and made a web page together. That they put that all together with basically off-the-shelf Pivotal products that that level of integration would be very difficult to do in a day in open source unless you really knew what you were doing. But they had a really productive experience just spending one day on writing that app. So I think that's the kind of being able to mix and match several different services together. That all, in this case, Pivotal CF, Pivotal RabbitMQ, Pivotal produces Spring XD for the stream processing and analytics, all that coming together.
Yeah, but we don't have like a community edition that scales to like 10 nodes and then the real edition that we use. That's how Eucalyptus died, and Josh McKenty is the guy that rewrote Eucalyptus in Python and called it OpenStack, is on the team. So we don't do crippleware, and we don't have a community version that isn't something we would run at the core of our services. So we try to add usability and then additional services in order to make our living.
So and of course, support and commercial support and all of that stuff too. So
yeah, absolutely, and more quiesced release, like a release every quarter versus every week.
Yeah, so I want to talk about BOSH for just a second. I'll add my thoughts on the conferences in a moment, but this idea about BOSH being hard to learn, and some of that is true. I think there's a bunch of usability things that we can improve in that tool because you basically have to build. You're basically building your own package manager for all the things you want on this distributed system, and then imposing your will on a bunch of VMs. And if you go look at how BOSH releases are structured, and then how BOSH deploys are structured, that is sort of the same thing you do in a normal package manager. It's just all buried in metadata files that you never have to deal with when you type apt-get install. But then once you kind of learn that and get up to the level where you can use BOSH, then it's very powerful. But I would add that in addition to the Ops Manager GUI, which sort of simplifies and packages some of that, there's a benefit to the CI that we run on our Bosch releases, so that you have at least a level of supportable, repeatable deployment that has been, just like Red Hat or some of these other people provide that sort of stability and peace of mind that it's been vetted. That's what Pivotal is doing for our customers with the services that we package with Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And then one other thing that just gets me really excited, this is taking advantage of things that are buried. They're in the open source, but it's not exposed. It's just a fire hose of metrics. But in our product, we're working on some really exciting metrics dashboards. They're capturing that on a per app, per instance basis, and displaying that in a way that I think it's going to transform the way that enterprises manage applications. Because unless you're at a pretty advanced web apps, web operations organization, you're not used to seeing that kind of information.
Does that help?
Oh, sure, quite a bit. I didn't expect that it was crippleware. It was more of, the concept that there's a version that is literally sold and supported, and then there's the open version. And many times when you have a version that's sold and supported, it will have proprietary components, an IP in it that just can't come out. And that's normally where I see that happen.
Yeah, but
so the way Pivotal's packaging, I'll let you talk in a minute, James, but basically you have the same code, there's the open source, and then we add more on top. There's no difference. It's like if you think about the way the Linux kernel works, the Linux kernel that you run in Ubuntu is the same as the Linux kernel you run in whatever, Gentoo or Red Hat. It's just someone else compiled it and put it together in a certain way and put a bunch of other stuff around it. And we're just taking that Cloud Foundry kernel and putting things around it that we think add value.
I like that, but the kernel's the same. That's the key, is that the kernel's the same.
What were you going to say, Waters?
I was going to say the same darn thing.
There you go. We haven't heard anything from Matt Stein, so I know we're interrupting TV nights.
I want Matt to do his deck later on, though.
We're not doing decks on this show.
People don't want to watch slides, James.
I want to see the deck, dude. Your deck is awesome.
We can put that on the webinar. I know the guy that runs marketing for Cloud Foundry. We can get that deck out there.
Nice. I was having to bite my tongue during the whole. We don't want developers to willy-nilly do things because you know how empowered I am.
Well, no, Matt. I'm just saying these are debates that happen over the course of the project.
No, I mean because I appreciate the side of the debate that most of us are on. I tend to give a little bit more credit to my code friends than maybe a lot of them deserve. Which is every time I start talking about all the microservices stuff and business capability teams and all this, people say, hey, yeah, about 20% of our devs can handle that, but the other 80% can't. And of course, my first response is, okay, well, maybe you should get rid of the other 80%, but that's,
Well, you don't necessarily have to get rid of them. Maybe you can level them up. And I give a lot of talks about organizational learning and the rest of this, but if you start with the premise that your developers are not smart and responsible, you're probably already losing it.
I think that's my point. You just stated it a little bit more eloquently than I did. But yeah, well, there's this saying that we've been tossed around for a few years. It says, well, what if we train all of our developers and they leave? And then we say, well, what if we don't train them and they stay?
Hey, Matt, so there was a social cast thread.
Yeah.
After Dark has turned into like a cult hit inside of Pivotal. Like, I don't know if anyone else in the world watches it, but it's a cult hit inside of Pivotal. So there was some controversy over us talking about, the Spring Boot output of the CF CLI. Do you want to give us your side of that and just do a little quick recap on that? Because there was probably what, 15, 20 comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my basic rundown. I don't want to rehash the whole conversation, but basically I've got this idea that Tomcat's not this special thing that if we know what version of Tomcat the application's running in, then if we say, oh, well, we're at the right patch level of that, then we're safe and we can move on. But, you know, the average enterprise Java application is probably bringing 35 or 40 external dependencies to the table. And really and truly, if you can't tell me all 40 of those are safe, then you're by definition unsafe. And so I take a little bit of issue with the fact that, okay, Spring Boot's doing this naughty thing by taking over Tomcat, but really and truly, your issue is with Maven or Gradle or whatever else, whatever other build management system the developers bring to the table. And if you could provide visibility in the platform somehow as to what all of the stuff that's in there, and I was kind of tossing this around a little bit earlier today. If you had this tight ALM integration where you could go back from an app all the way to the commit that resulted in that deployment, and you could say, oh, well, there's a pom.xml in there or something that enumerates all the dependencies, and I can grab that dependency graph and say, hey, for this app, here's all the crap that they brought, and these 2-3 things here have been flagged as whatever. Now you might get some false positives in that for whatever reason because there's some exclusions going on that you don't see, but to me that's a lot more interesting of a thing than just to say, oh, we can take Tomcat's control back. Because if you think about it, you deploy a Ruby app, Ruby's bringing its own web server. You deploy any of these other languages, pretty much, they're bringing their own web server to the table, except in our build packs, we say, oh, Bundler ran, here's all the junk that Bundler brought in, so you can say, oh, look, there. And in fact, that's kind of what you want from the Java side, is you have all the Ruby gems enumerated, but you don't have all of the Java jar files enumerated.
So is there a practical way to inspect the jar and get that graph?
Not really in a consistent way, because there's so many different ways that you can package that thing. Like Boots is actually one of the more intelligible because it does not violate the original packaging of the dependencies. It actually takes the jars and embeds them, and then writes kind of a special class loader deal to bring those things in properly. Your average developer is doing this strange thing where it's making this uber jar or fat jar, where it basically blows up all the jar files, takes all the class files, and inserts them in this one thing, and then you have no freaking clue where any of this stuff actually came from. So you might have one or both coming to the table. There's very popular Maven plugins that do that sort of thing. So if you're not using Spring Boot, you're probably doing something like that. If you're trying to package a big deal, it's very popular to take libraries that you don't want to deal with actually delivering the individual dependencies and just kind of throw them in there that way. So,
well, I mean, I think that the key question to me is how much of that should be responsibility of the platform versus the whatever build pipeline that the enterprise or the organization adopts.
I mean, my personal opinion is that I think that being able to have visibility all the way from the commit up to the deployed app and everything that happened in between is something that the platform should support well. I don't know if the platform needs to own it, but it's probably easier to implement if the platform does own it, because then you can be a little bit prescriptive about how you do things.
I mean, I think the only way to do it is that for each runtime you have a strong opinion about the convention so that you can recover that stuff so you're not trying to sort out a bunch of class files in one big block.
Yeah.
Hey, are we getting
I agree.
Are we getting access to a lot of people in?
Yeah, it's being suggested that I drop out and come back in.
Dine's the one that's like
So let me try this.
So Jim, we have a counterexample here, but there are places where we can enable the operators to know when they need to patch something that is transparent to the app and the developer. You want to talk a little bit about that one, James?
Yeah, in the chat, I'm not sure if the chat will show up to people that are getting a broadcast, but if you go to cloudfoundry.org, there's a link to the wiki, and then on the right-hand side on the nav bar on the wiki, you'll see design documents. And one of the top design documents, you'll see a mapping dependencies for build packs. And it has been in our long-term plans for a while to have the build packs have this expressive capability where they're going to be able to explain what dependencies they put into the build pack when you let's say this version of Java, this version of Tomcat, this version of Spring Boot, and that'll give the platform some kind of a record for every single time you push an application, and then operators could presumably use that metadata about your application and the dependencies in it to query it. So, give you an example. When we had Ghost come out, if let's just say Ghost would have been more a different kind of vulnerability, like targeted at a particular version of the JVM, then an operator could use a queryable interface to say, show me all the apps running this compromised JVM and below, and then they could use another capability of the platform that we have, which we call the Notifications API. Notifications API the operator could use that to send all of those developers that are responsible for those applications a notice saying, hey, you have about a week to upgrade your apps because they're running an insecure JVM, and if you don't patch them in a week, then and the query still shows that you're running an old vulnerable JVM, I'm going to shut them down. So you could do things like that. That's not like I said. These are plans. They're not. We have design documents for these things, but we hope to work on them soon. Notifications is actually in the product now. The dependencies is the thing that we're still having to add.
It was a pretty interesting debate, though, because a lot of the Spring developers were like, hey, don't patch my app. Get out of here, right? Like, don't even think about that. So, which is also understandable from a Java dependencies mindset, right? You wouldn't want anyone but the developer understanding that, and CI having verified it, etc. So, but there is a line there somewhere, and I think we can also provide increasing visibility upstack over time. So, I think that's what makes it a PaaS, quote unquote. Sorry, Andrew. Is that it has a bunch of nouns and verbs that are very application-centric versus like here's your virtual machines and networks, right? Like here's your app dependencies that are in it over time.
I think visibility is the key. I mean, there's only so much that you can actually remediate automatically in that situation, but it's also really hard to get a good picture of what your dependencies are. Even when you're sitting at the developer workstation and you're issuing commands to Maven or whatever saying, hey, what are you actually bringing in when you do this? And you get this really ugly graph thing that you can kind of decipher. So if you could provide that visibility and say, look, across all of our app portfolio, these things depend on this thing that's been flagged. If you could do that, fixing that's probably pretty quick. It's just a matter of being able to know. So I think it's less about patching stuff that's running than it is about letting people know that, hey.
Absolutely. And that's where I came from, which is that right now there's a small bug that it doesn't tell you the Tomcat that's running. It tells you the Tomcat it thought it tried to run and boot overrode it.
Really, we need to fix that.
It's just a small bug, but it created this huge firestorm of a debate about like who owns the dependencies. It was pretty interesting.
Get off my lawn.
There's no territorialism in IT and between developers and operators at all, thankfully. So that was a positive thing that we did.
You'll pry my container from my cold dead hands.
Hey, Andy Ripka's on.
Hey, James.
You know what's awesome, Andy?
Well, lots of things about this software product, but...
You remember when you said, let's go hold the Cloud Foundry workshop in St. Louis almost a year ago, last March?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm just amazed at how many people that were at that workshop are now like headed towards production, or I just got this note where this one GPS electronics company might have some big, positive results from using Cloud Foundry, which is pretty exciting. So, just wanted a little hat tip to Andy Ripka, who's the FE that did the very first hands-on roadshow ever for folks. And no one in headquarters told them to do it out there. They're like, hey, let's just start teaching people Cloud Foundry in these big rooms. Let's do it.
Well, I had a lot of help, but thanks for saying that, James.
I thought it was awesome. So, Schaefer, what else is on the docket?
Well, I want to hear more about what's awesome.
Well, what's awesome is that we sold out. Like, I love the joke that no one watches this, but like people are tweeting that they can't get into the Hangout because we're at the max number of people.
It's what we do around here.
It's disappointing. It was more fun when no one watched. We could say anything we wanted.
Are we going to give away secrets today?
I have plenty.
We have another person that often joins us, but he's not a pivotal person. What's Rob Hirschfield up to today?
Hey guys, I'm hacking console, believe it or not.
SUL?
SUL console, HashiCorp's. Yeah, I needed an Erlang client. That was my night's activity, was to build an Erlang client for HashiCorp console.
I just saw Mitchell in Belgium.
Yeah.
What's it like, Rob? What's the like if someone wants to write one for Haskell, how hard is it going to be?
It was pretty trivial. Like I banged out pretty much all I needed in a couple hours. So yeah, I mean it's a much bigger deal to figure out how you're going to use it. Than writing a wrapper for it's not a big. It's just Rest.
What are you going to use the console Erlang wrapper for?
That's harder to explain. We're adjusting Crowbar to use service registration, and so there's a really interesting element where as services get installed, they're registered in console, and then we can then resolve the operational dependencies using console. And so we use Erlang for our behavior-driven development environment, the testing infrastructure, and so we crossed the line where the code relies on service registration, and so I had to be able to register services outside of the normal process. So, is that too vague? Maybe
No,
it's
I
too
think
vague.
it makes sense. Good times. I think there's a bunch of open questions about how to do service discovery that Cloud Foundry is going to explore in the next probably 6 months, I'd say.
I think it's from Michael, who's an architect at a very big bank, who joined last week, and he is the biggest console fan, and I know he's watching on YouTube right now because he couldn't come in tonight. So, Michael, this console conversation is for you. We'll probably have a bunch more.
We're finding console really useful on ops and physical ops. So not just on app and app dependency. So if somebody wants to geek on that, it's a little off topic for here, but we're really excited.
I'll give you a Twitter intro to Michael P. when this is over.
Service
awesome.
discovery is definitely on topic for Cloud Foundry After Dark.
Yeah, I don't know how many people know this, but console is actually used inside of Diego, the next generation runtime component that we actually expect to go to our production hosted service this week if the schedule holds. So that's pretty exciting. We're using it for some internal service discovery for some of our components that make up Diego.
Cool.
So is that using etcd and console?
Yeah, we're using them for different things. So we're using etcd for the shared state consistent view of configuration, and probably a little bit more than we should be using it for, frankly, for sharing data, storing some data. But we're using console just for the service discovery aspect right now.
Yeah, Michael P. right on target DM'd me. He's like, "Cool, glad you're talking about it. Why are you using both etcd and console?" So. I I mean, I think the truth is that we try to be incredibly pragmatic, and Ansi carefully tests and selects tech to use as use cases within, what he's doing with Diego. So we should probably have Ansi on to elucidate people on one etcd, one console, and et cetera in some depth. Do you think, James?
Yeah, I think so. Like, let me give it a little bit more color too. We've been using etcd for quite a while, probably like around a year or so. In the first rewrite of the Health Manager for Cloud Foundry, which we replaced a Ruby code base with a Go code base, and Ansi selected etcd for that. And one of the things we had found with etcd was that when we scaled it up to multiple nodes, there were some corner cases where things would go bad. Even though we were only using it as a temporary system of record, it would kind of get locked up and be hard to clear out. So they recently fixed those issues, and we upgraded to etcd 2.0, and we put a lot more testing and put it through its paces, and we're successfully able to cluster it up, and that issue isn't there anymore. So that we're pretty excited about that. But Consul came out in the meantime, and Consul has DNS discovery built right into it. So with etcd, you can put on something like SkyDNS added on top. But given that the Consul just comes with it baked right in, it made a lot of sense for us to just incorporate that, especially since it was for a separate use case altogether inside of Diego. So it wasn't. We didn't really want to rely on etcd for two things at the same time. It made for a pretty clean separation when we looked at it. But yeah, Ansi should probably come on and talk more about it. I mean, the etcd, abusing etcd like we are for some of the transactional, not really transactional, but just more high volume stuff than we should be. Ansi has plans about how to rectify that.
So only use etcd when you need the strongest consistency. Is that just layman's terms, James? What you're saying, or?
Yeah, like we're pumping a lot of updates to it at a higher volume than etcd is really probably designed for. And so just sharing more occasional configuration that should be consistent across the cluster is really what we should be using it for. And we're going to investigate some other ways of doing the high volume stuff.
Yeah, Michael P. Wrote back. They're looking at it for multi-data center configuration, which kind of makes sense, and that's we'll have to have him on and talk a little bit about how they're looking at it.
Mitchell was telling me about some fairly sophisticated, large-scale multi-data center deployments of Consul that are working pretty well. We have an empty slot if he wants to jump in. He's still out there.
Jay joined, Jay Cuthrell, longtime friend of mine at VCE. I don't think he expected to get in. He's like, I'm going to drop in case someone needs it. Like there's some dying need to be in After Dark. Hey, Schaefer, why don't you spike the football a little bit on the awesome hire that you added to your team?
Oh, Mr. Michael Cote? The one and only Cote?
Never heard of him. What's he do?
Well, he's I first met him when he was an analyst at an open source analyst firm called RedMonk, and it's probably the best $5,000 I ever spent while I was at Puppet Labs to do a bunch of podcasts with Michael Cote, and he did some write-ups, and we just kind of stayed around the industry. He's been covering sort of systems management and automation for as long as I've seen him, and he spent a little bit of time over there at Dell with Rob and those guys, and then now he was at 451 until, let's see, it's been a month now since his first day at Pivotal. So Cote joined. He's had a couple blog posts. He's working on some interesting stuff, and he came on this journey. We went to Monkey Gras to see his old comrades at RedMonk, and then we went to FOSDEM, which is like its own reality, quite an experience, and then we ended up at Configuration Management Camp with. We're gonna do a bit of a write-up about it, but I think Cote is going to have a meaningful impact on the quality of the narrative coming out of Pivotal with respect to Pivotal Cloud Foundry.
Why are all these smart people coming here, man? It's we have 2 more big things to announce. The exec director of the foundation is just a rock star. Can't wait for that to come out in the next couple weeks. And then
that might come out this week.
Well, we can't tell the people. Well, I guess we should sell some secrets, right? This is after dark. But someone
we won't tell who it is.
Someone just tweeted we have 19 darn live viewers. Like, how am I going to tell secrets to 2 people when there's 20 people watching this thing?
You gotta give the people what they want, Waters.
We made it Sunday night when everyone's kids are being read stories, like intentionally, so no one can watch this, and now 19 viewers.
Anyway, you were saying.
So the other guy that's joining, Arnie spent a lot of time with, and an old friend of ours, Mark Phillips, ex-Basho, was kind of hearing a little bit about James Barrows playing poker with him one night. And his only response when I told him who else was coming was he said, "I weep for your enemies." That was Phillips' response to the final shoe to drop in terms of the big hires this month.
And that will be, when will that be public? That's another week or 2 out?
That's end of probably the last week of February. We might talk a little bit about that.
It's going to be quite a ride. I'm really excited about the executive director, and one of the things that I thought was a proof point was when Rob Mee came back from the board meeting and said how he was impressed. You know, knowing Rob's background and Rob's personality, the fact that that's a vote of confidence like no other.
Yeah, and you know, I'll share a little bit about the new ED's philosophy that I like so much without saying who it is. And Rob, we observed this thing called the OpenStack board a lot as we were trying to assemble how to make Cloud Foundry work. And
let me help you.
And I don't hate to give away any secrets, but the conclusion we came to was that the OpenStack board probably could not be surmised to work. Now, it does good things, but it's pretty heavy. And so what the new ED's philosophy is that he wants to run it like a startup where he is hired as the CEO by the board, but the board doesn't make every decision, right? And I think
the board doesn't make any decision.
Right. Like the way he talked to me about it, and I loved it, and it means that we don't get as much control and others don't get as much control, but it's actually just an empowered, smart human, which is like, look, you get to vote if you want to fire me, okay? That's the control you have as the board. You don't vote on everything that we do. And we're going to run this the way a startup board is run. And I think that's so amazing, and I think if he pulls that off, it could change a lot of these open source bodies. And he said, you know, we want to be a startup, not a consortium. And that was his quote. Rob, I don't know if you want to share any thoughts from OpenStack board.
No, well, I think that a lot of people confuse different parts of the OpenStack governance process. And so, you know, I like how Cloud Foundry has made some very different decisions than OpenStack. You know, I think the way that you groom developers, the way you maintain the gate, the way you're running the community and the vendors are very different, which I appreciate because I think that all of these projects and these governance issues are a bit, you know, they're still experimental. We're still learning.
Right.
How to make this happen at this scale with these types of companies. And so, you know, I love that you're making other choices, and we'll get to learn from that. Most people really don't understand this. It's not even subtle. You know, what the foundation does, what the board does, what the TC does, and you know, there's a missing. We have a new product management working group that's coming up that looks like it might actually provide some of the missing additional strategy and governance that's been absent. But yeah, it's hard. Boards are really not good entities to drive strategy. They really should be there to check strategy, to watch analysis, and to help get things done. That's what you'd want a board to do. And so I like your to be announced ED's strategy on having a more hands-on directorship, having a more hands-on foundation, because I actually think, without getting into trouble, the foundation is often very hands-off in its approach to managing the project and the code and how those things run, and so it has its consequences.
Yeah, and we we pulled in a very technical ED, so I think he's more than willing to understand what this thing actually is versus just a parliamentary procedure around a foundation.
Yeah, I think the challenge becomes if they become too opinionated in how that goes, you could end up having people feel disenfranchised. My sense of Cloud Foundry as a whole is that's okay from Cloud Foundry's governance model. That your goal is not to make everybody happy, and so
I'd argue OpenStack would be better off right now if it worried less about making everybody happy.
I have a simple goal, Rob. My goal is to get my customers promoted. Like when I walk into a place, I'm like, oh, who here wants a big promotion next year? Come with me. That is my simple battle cry.
Yeah, I think that I like what y'all are doing, and I watch it, and it's the reason I'm here, right? It's one of the things I like to see. There is a bit of OpenStack's #1 objective seems to be to get OpenStack developers better paying jobs when they change companies.
I said the users of Cloud Foundry, not the developers of Cloud Foundry, right? I'm worried about our users.
So one thing I want to call attention to really fast is that while we're talking about these new hires for the Cloud Foundry Foundation, is that one of them did publicly announce themselves this week in the mailing list. Chip Childers, he's the technology chief of staff.
This is a calculator. I am a terrorist carrying weapons of math instruction.
That just happened.
All right, then.
Continue.
So I was saying, Chip introduced himself on the Cloud Foundry mailing list, and one of the things he brought to the surface right away was a community code of conduct. So if anyone feels like they want to weigh in on the Cloud Foundry code of conduct while it's being formed, it took inspiration from a lot of other places, but Chip is a go-getter. I spent some time with him this last week, and man, he's going to be a great asset for the foundation. He's a full-time employee.
Well, I would add everyone I met so far, from the ED to Chip to this other guy that's doing communications for them, and then all the people at the Linux Foundation, they're all pros. It's going to be, I think it's going to be transformative. So my perspective on Cloud Foundry up to now is it's sort of understated and undersold relative to how good it actually is. And I think that the way that the foundation was put together, there was a year where there was a void, and the foundation, all those members of the foundation sort of waited for everyone to promote Cloud Foundry independently, and no one really did. But that's going to be fixed in the next 6 months, and it's going to change everything.
Yeah, but Shafe, it's like I said, it's nerve-wracking to be underhyped in a sense, but I kind of like the underdog position in any fight, and the opposite.
Look at you lying. What is that?
I love the underdog position. I really do. Ask all my friends in college, like, James doesn't know how to be anything but an underdog. But there's been a lot of hype in the Linux container world, and today someone released a whole website to try to diffuse some of the hype. I don't know if you saw that or anyone else saw that. Jambay, did you see that? What did you think?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that was the most coherent.
Sort of a hardcore Unix guy doesn't like the next new abstraction.
Yeah, that I've seen much better diplomatically and constructive analysis than that one in particular. I thought there was one earlier in the week, right, that got a lot of hype on Hacker News. And that one actually raised some interesting points, but it did it in kind of an aggressive tone.
That's by Cal Leeming, who I only know because he was talking to Redis fame Salvatore.
Salvatore, yeah. Yeah, that's actually how I found it, because Salvatore was like, oh, I sure hope I can make this guy happy with my tools, because if he's like, if this guy gives me a compliment, I know I'm in a good space. He brought up some good points, and it got a lot of discussion on both Reddit and Hacker News. So I think you should go read those posts and judge for yourself what you think. But there are definitely some good pros and cons brought up in that whole debate.
I think my point was you want to be careful on the hype side, because if you advertise yourself as solving every hard computer science problem in the world, some people that take their job seriously there's gonna be blowback.
Well, I think it also speaks to the narratives around the way that this technology is being delivered now, where you don't see a lot of hype coming out of Amazon, right? Like they just sit back and blog at midnight. They're not out there trying to tell you how great it is.
Oh, hold on. After reInvent, I think pre-reInvent that's true, but after reInvent, they turned up they went full enterprise after reInvent started happening, I think, but that's just me.
We'll see. Well, I am seeing a preponderance of Amazon videos in YouTube now, so.
Yeah, I think Lambda was probably overhyped for the impact that it's had thus far, as an example. I think a lot of people were really curious about it, and maybe that kind of approach is actually going to still take off and get a lot of traction. But I think it initially had this, just like everyone was just talking about all the time. Oh, this is going to transform everything, and then I haven't heard anyone actually using it for anything real.
I think it's hard to adopt those kind of new paradigms. It's hard for developers to go from what they're doing day to day to like all of a sudden jump into a totally new paradigm, which is what Lambda represents. I think there's also some other interesting issues with you're all in Amazon if you go to Lambda. Like there's no turning back at that point. So I think there's a bunch of factors.
I mean, I think Stein's job on the team is to bring developers into a new paradigm, microservices, and next generation service discovery, while keeping them productive.
Well, going back to the service discovery,
Matt.
Stein's been working on some interesting stuff, taking advantage of the Netflix open source and the way they do service discovery. So maybe we could jump on that.
Yeah, we're working on bringing kind of the basic foundational Netflix open source stuff as Cloud Foundry services. We actually have 2 of them running with a service broker now, and I can actually deploy all this good stuff with our ops manager tooling, and it's pretty nice to be able to go in and say, hey, CF create service Eureka, and bind apps to it, and start to see things popping up and being able to discover things and wire things in without very much effort at all. The problem with Eureka, though, is that once you're in the door, you're fully in the door. And when I've been talking to some of our customers about this stuff, they're like, yeah, we've looked into that, but we want to put some fences around things and tell people, you're in this part of the organization, that means that you can discover these services over here, but not these services over there. And one of the things that we've been working on a separate track from getting these things kind of bootstrapped is, okay, well, what's our solution going to look like when we go beyond, okay, here's a Eureka that you can create in a space, and you can bind a bunch of apps to it, and they can discover each other, but that's never going to really fly across the entire deployment.
So is that implementing role-based access at that service broker? I mean, the service.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea, is that they want to be able to say an app shows up with an identity, and that identity has certain entitlements given to it that says, hey, if this is you, then you're allowed to discover the location and existence of these things, but not these things over here.
So just for people who kind of know how Cloud Foundry works, how are you doing the service discovery with the routers and Eureka and the way you connect the IPs to it?
Yeah, so back up from that a little bit. So if you're not familiar with how Eureka works, you have a client running inside of your app that basically creates a lease with Eureka and says, hey, this is me, and I'm located here. And it's the app's responsibility to tell Eureka where that is. So once we started with this, what we've been doing is, okay, well, I can look in my environment and I can see as a Cloud Foundry app what are the routes that have been assigned to me when I started up. And we plucked the first route out of that array and register you with Eureka as that. So when you start doing discovery and say, oh, give me the location of this thing, you get handed the CF route. and you talk to that directly. But that kind of takes away a lot of the flexibility of things that they like to do with Ribbon, which is their client-side load balancing solution, which is, again, it's another library that you bring into your app, and it gives you a lot of pluggable load balancing algorithms and some other things that you can do there, like zone affinity. So if I've got an app deployed in 2 different availability zones on EC2, I can say prefer this one that's closer to me over this one that's over there. So there's a lot of neat things you can do there, but if that kind of assumes that you're going to have knowledge of the actual IP address and port of where all these service instances are deployed, which out of the gate we didn't actually do for various reasons on Cloud Foundry. But the team just delivered, I guess it was maybe 2 weeks ago, James, I think, a story that will allow the environment variables that tell you what the DEA IP and port for that application is to be injected. I hear myself echoing again. Lovely.
You sound fine on my side, Matt.
Okay, well, as long as I sound fine out there, I'll just deal with it over here.
So then would you be able to put like the ribbon behind the Go routers and then do point-to-point with app instances?
Yeah, so now I've got my ribbon inside my app, and I go to Eureka, and I say, hey, I want to know about all the services. I'm actually getting IP addresses and ports for DEAs and the app containers that are there. But you have to opt into that. So I think that's going to be a deployment manifest property when you do Bosch deploy runtime. Pretty sure that's how it works, isn't it, James?
Yeah, that's right. We want people to opt into that. Like if you're running in a multi-tenant mode, you don't necessarily want people, just anyone talking to anybody else's containers.
Right. And there's another property in Warden that you actually need to turn on, which is to give me access to the DEA's network. So like if you get set an instance of an app and it's actually deployed on the same DEA as you are, then by default you can't actually talk directly to that app. So there's another opt-in property there. So you take all these properties, you put them together, and it's this thing that when I've been talking with customers, I've been calling it promiscuous mode.
Yeah.
And so it's truly that promiscuous. It'll be when you opt in, you're pretty much saying anybody from within the walls of PCF can access me directly.
Well, for today, that's the case. So now you take that and you put that with placement pools, and then you can start to do some more interesting things. It says, okay, these things in this placement pool over here, they get to be promiscuous with each other, but then this other placement pool over here, they've got kind of the standard lockdown scenario. And so when you want this use case and you have valid reasons to grab it, then you enable that for a subset. But today, until we get that in position, it's opt-in. You're either all in or you're not.
Yeah, and well, there is a kind of a mitigating control in place with application security groups.
Yeah.
So your outbound network policy is still being applied on a per application basis in that case. So even though an operator might flip this bit to turn promiscuous mode on, as Matt affectionately calls it, there are other controls in place, but it takes you have to be aware of what's going on to make sure that the network policies you want in place really are in place.
Yeah, that's entirely true. I forgot to mention that.
So we're doing an hour. We're an hour and 5 in. We want to keep going on this topic for a minute, or we have anything else?
I mean, I had a couple more things I wanted to throw out there because I wouldn't mind some feedback on this kind of proposal we're running with for multi-tenancy. But
Rob's out. He's a pumpkin. Good night, Rob. Thanks for joining.
See y'all. It's always good to talk.
Yeah, great having you.
See you.
Let's have the 5-minute version. Let's hear it.
All right, the 5-minute version. So basically what we're running with now is anytime you create a Eureka, service, we're pushing an app, and that app has the Eureka server-side bits in it, and then you're binding to that thing. And that's cool as long as all the services you want to discover are in the same space with you. Well, the problem with that is that's not going to fly for very long. So, let me share my screen real quick. I just want to show a couple diagrams, and then I'll hush.
I got all night, man. Keep going. Like, if
All
people
right.
are watching at 9 o'clock on a Sunday, they care a lot. So go into detail.
All right, dude. So you see this diagram here, the nice little blue box with some white boxes and some arrows.
Yep.
And on that, good old architecture diagram. So yeah, I've got a bunch of apps that have registered with this Eureka thing, and I have this other thing that's coming over and discovering so it can connect, and that's all cool. But I've got a bunch of question marks out here to the side saying, hey, I can't discover beyond this space. So one of the things that's interesting about Eureka is that you can peer Eurekas up. And when you peer them up, they actually replicate all of their data amongst one another. So we, in our service broker, we have the ability to do some things, beyond just what the service broker API permits. It's just an app, so we can build a UI for it, do some interesting things. We thought, why don't we give an administrator the ability to say, okay, I've got this Eureka that I know about in this space, another one in this space, another one in this space. I want to allow these three spaces to discover services from each other. So I go into some user interface and I say, okay, take CF space 1, 2, and 3 and peer up its Eurekas. And so when I do that, all of the apps that are registered to any of those are now visible across all those spaces. So if you build this kind of structure up, then you can do some things like say, all right, maybe all Eurekas in a single space can peer with one another. That's really easy to do. Or let's say all Eurekas in this space peer with all Eurekas in that space. That was kind of the thing I had in the diagram. Or let's say all the Eurekas in a given org can peer up with all other Eurekas in that org. Or I can do cherry picking or do something more grassroots and say, hey, this space is going to opt in to replicating with these spaces over here at the space owner level instead of at the super administrator type level. So I think if you kind of take the Cloud Foundry policy structures around orgs and spaces and then kind of meld that with the fact that we have this service discovery thing, and then walk in and say, okay, if you define your policies around visibility around orgs and spaces, which is kind of what a lot of customers are already doing, then you can start to layer this service discovery piece on top of it, and we're not changing the underlying implementation technology at all. We're saying, hey, this thing that was, if you're in, you're all in, it's still that way. We're just doing a controlled set of replication across policies that a customer would come in and turn on themselves. And it could be then, again, very fine-grained, say this Eureka, this Eureka, this Eureka, or it could be these orgs get to discover across each other, or these spaces get to discover across each other. So that's kind of...
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So when you do a peering, it's all or nothing, right? Like you just share everything.
All or nothing.
Yeah, that's what I was just wondering. It seems pretty like once they peer, they're all kind of blended in the same space almost.
And then if you peer A to B and B to C, does that mean that A is paired with C?
Yep.
Okay, so it's basically like you just join a cluster of Eurekas.
Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing.
So is there some way, because it seems like you'd want a little finer grain control over the access, so you think it would be possible to do more kind of role-based opt-in, opt-in and expose one app versus share everything?
You could totally do that. You just can't do it with Eureka without cracking open Eureka and significantly changing.
No, but and dangerously riffing out loud here, having seen this the first time, we can still control what apps are allowed to what to bind to what Eurekas.
No, that's totally true.
Right. So in the space policy, you could say, hey, these apps are allowed to touch this Eureka or not.
Do we have that?
Well, I mean, you have the service broker controls.
I mean, if you're in a space, you can bind to any service in that space.
Right. I guess it would have to be out of space. So the question is, if two apps are in this, I mean, Bear is the expert here, but if two apps are in the same space, they can theoretically touch it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, right now there's two different things. One is can the app bind to the service? The answer is yes. The second part of it is like, so now the service is going to have an environment variable in the app that says, I'm over here, go talk to me at this IP address or this host. There's a second aspect that is the application security groups, which would say whether you actually could talk to it or not based on the IP tables rules that would be applied. But it'd be kind of silly to allow an app to bind to a service that you couldn't talk to. So I think one console actually has some finer grained ACLs inside of console. I haven't taken a look at what they have, but I had heard that Netflix actually has some other stuff that they don't have fully open source. I don't know, Matt, if you know about that.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to get in behind the curtain and see some of the. I mean, Eureka 2 is in the works, so there's probably going to be some more interesting things there. And I actually had an engineer on my team spend 2 weeks really deep diving into console, just to see if the use cases I was trying to express could be done that way. And the TLDR on his answer was not yet. That maybe a couple more versions down the road in HashiCorp's roadmap, there might be something that we could do. But kind of the short answer was, based on what structures are available now, we're kind of on equal standing with what we can do with Eureka and console. And console is actually a little more complicated for us to do right now. So I want to see what we can do with Eureka and test some of this out and just see how, what kind of policies that we could actually express, take this out for a spin with a couple customers and say, okay, let's say you had this power. Would this allow you to express the things that you want to express? And just get some feedback on it, because it won't take us very long to build this feature set. And then test drive it and say, okay, here's what you can do. Does this work for you? Or what can you not do that you want to be able to do? If you want to get fine-grained down to saying, okay, I don't care how the technology works, I just want these 4 apps over here to be discoverable by these 2 apps over here. If you want to get that fine-grained, then Eureka as it exists today, or really almost any service discovery solution that we've looked at, it doesn't have that fine-grained a capability. Not to say that we couldn't go build that. Of course, now that's become one of the popular things to throw out and say that, yeah, go ahead, roll your own service discovery. That's a good idea. But maybe we end up doing that at some point. I don't know.
So we're about a quarter after the hour now. Should we go all night?
Cornelia, how was your week on ops?
You're on mute, Cornelia.
You're on mute, Cornelia.
How was your muted week on ops, Cornelia? Oh, she's talking on the phone.
No, I had to find the mute button. So this is in the wrong window. Oh, now it's switching back and forth.
We can see you.
Matt, you're still sharing your screen.
Oh, okay.
It was awesome. So one of the things I got to do this week was a prod deploy from end to end, which was really cool. And what we were in fact doing is we did a stem cell only deploy. So we didn't change. We were talking about Bosch earlier this hour, and this wasn't all about Bosch, but one of the things that's so darn cool about Bosch is that, yeah, you've got these complex manifests, but these manifests are declarative. So what Bosch is actually doing is not just deploying what's in the manifest, but it keeps the system in a state that matches the manifest. So way cool stuff. So we actually didn't change the manifest at all in this prod deploy. We just changed the stem cell. which is what you would do if you, for example, needed to patch the OS because of some exploit or something. And so zero downtime deploy, it was the coolest thing to watch because this was PDubs. So Cloud Ops, for those of you who don't know, was the team that keeps PDubs up and running. And so they rolled a new stem cell this week, and we started in the morning, and it pretty much went smoothly. We learned a few things about port mappings and things like that along the way. I actually announced in the morning, boy, I hope that something goes wrong. And of course, all my colleagues were like, no! But given that I wanted to learn, I was like, you know, that's where you learn stuff. So it was good. Did a prod deploy, built some pipelines. So really starting to work more and more on the pipelines. We have quite a few. But you know, one of the interesting things that I'll share with you is that this is kind of a DevOps reflection. I'll be very interested to get your take, Andrew. But we used to not have a cloud ops team at Pivotal. So the ops was done by all of the different teams that were doing dev. So devs were really doing, our flavor of DevOps back then was devs are doing ops.
I mean, that was Matthew Coker's instinct, which is like, I want to do DevOps, and I want to do DevOps with devs.
Yeah. And so, and that worked well for quite some time, but you might ask, well, why do we have a cloud ops team now? And I think that the impetus for it was that that when you start to do operations, there are some things that are still, you know, you get an exploit, and now you have to drop everything, and you have to patch, you have to create a new stem cell, you have to deploy that new stem cell, and so on. So it was definitely affecting the velocity of the teams in terms of being able to deliver new features. So I think that was the impetus for pulling things off to the side. And so now we have this Cloud Ops team, which I'm not exactly sure how old it is. It's less than 6 months. Is that true? It's still relatively new, and so there's a lot.
I've been here for more than 6 months, and it already existed when I got here. So
okay.
About 9 months, Bear. Do you remember when we finally said, hey, we think it's costing us too much on runtime engineering productivity to also do ops? 9 months.
I think it was about a year ago, actually.
Maybe a year ago. And so the interesting thing is that I mentioned that we were working on pipelines this week, and so there's pipelines in place, and they're very good, but they don't have. They tend to be, because Cloud Foundry, of course, has many different subteams, and so each of the subteams was responsible for their pipelines. And what was missing was a Cloud Ops team that had a holistic view across all of those different subsystems, across the pipelines and how they all work together. They got things working quite effectively, but I'm seeing now that the Cloud Ops team, when they start to look and they're revisiting and they're upgrading some of those pipelines, that they tend to have a much more holistic view across all of those subsystems. So it's been an interesting exercise for me to kind of reflect on that as I've been learning the processes and going through the processes, to see the value of both a DevOps model where dev does ops, and then having a Cloud Ops team that...
There was never a DevOps model where dev does ops. That's a misinterpretation.
No, I know, except that we were doing it at Cloud Foundry. And you know, Andrew, that you've heard me say DevOps does not mean developers have to do ops. That I understand that, but I think a lot of people do interpret it quite that literally.
So one of the things I've been on both sides of this, and when you have interrupt-driven work and project work, it's a disaster. It's so hard to plan, and the context switching back and forth kills you. And especially when you're doing something where you say, okay, you've time boxed these commitments or whatever, or you're trying to do this thing. And then the next thing you know, you're staying up till 4 in the morning patching some stuff on some caffeine, and then, oh, now we're behind on our commitments, and just ends up being this demoralizing downward spiral. And so there's a good reason for developers to have operational understanding, and for the people with operational responsibilities to understand development and the application. But I think for the purpose of doing the work, then you need to have a fairly clean separation of responsibilities.
Well, and the other thing, the reason that Janve and I raised our hands at the time, because we're very product delivery focused, was that you can only have really 8. It's the kind of 2 pizza box team rule. You can only have like 8, 10 developers on a backlog really working on one thing. And so if you impose the overhead of operations as well on them, now you've got a max people size in terms of the team from the development perspective, and you're putting half of their work as operations. Your feature throughput, it can be, that, Jambe, I remember very well you and I being concerned about feature throughput was suffering too much.
To take this farther, though, if you get too far disconnected from the actual development and you don't have the context and you don't have any way to call those people, when stuff starts blowing up in the middle of the night, then you're kind of in a world of hurt. So you need to have...
That was the counter-argument from engineering at the time. They were very worried about engineering getting away from development operations because they wouldn't know the pain and that they wouldn't be automating things, etc.
But I can tell you from personal experience it's working extremely well. The number of times that we're talking to Yui in a given day, it's constant communication. And it's very high bandwidth, but it's also not a huge tax. It's our conversations with Yui are sometimes 30 seconds long. It's, hey, we published a SHA, which is one of the ways that we start a prod deploy, is that the runtime team gives us a Git SHA. So that gives us the information that we need to know to say, okay, this is the version of what's in the repositories that we're going to go through, and then now we can start our operational process. So,
I have a quick question, and we're going to end up talking all night if we keep rolling topics forward. But you're working on the Cloud Ops team remotely, right?
No, I've been working in the office.
So you're in San Francisco, or you were in San Francisco?
Yep, I'll be there again tomorrow morning.
So you did how long? 6 weeks?
No, I'm doing a 4-week rotation, so this is my last week coming up.
So you spent a month in San Francisco.
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, that's one of the unique things about Cornelia's team is that we give platform engineering the ability to rotate and to do deep dive projects because they only exist to provide a level of depth that normal product management or field engineering isn't going to be able to give right away to a customer. So we want asymmetric expertise development.
Right, but I kind of question that a bit. I think we should rotate more people around stuff.
Oh, we're talking about that too.
So to be clear, Andrew, you don't question doing that. You question making that exclusive to them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you phrased it in the most combative way possible.
That's how I do things.
I question that. When you really mean what you really meant was we should do more of that.
We should do more of that.
But when you put it through the filter, it came out with combative.
It is 23 minutes after midnight. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Oh, he's going into psycho mode.
Yeah, but
one thing from the field engineers that a bunch of them have contacted me. They're really eager to do dojo rotations where they come and work embedded with the engineering team. One of the challenges with that is it takes a little while of ramp up time. And if you're on the engineering team and you're ramping someone up for several weeks, and then right at the time when they get ready to contribute at a high level, they leave. And then they go back to being a field engineer. That's kind of a frustrating experience. But I think Cornelia has been.
But you have to look at the whole system. You have to look at the systemic investment that you're making, not on that one engineer or that one FE.
Yeah. Oh, there's good ways and bad ways that we can try to execute this, and so we're definitely talking about doing more rotations and finding the best way to do it. With field engineers in particular, taking them out of the field can be a burden as well. But yeah, we're totally working on that. Internal dojo, not just external dojos.
It's a reward for closing a big deal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like that.
Did we do enough secrets today before we wrap up? I don't feel like we gave any good secrets. I mean, now
let's give some secrets and then call it a night.
I mean, I feel like there should always be some secrets if you last an hour and 25 into a Sunday night show.
I don't know. I don't know which things are out of bounds. So why don't you give the secrets?
It's always a judgment call for me every week of what won't quite get me fired.
How bad is James's judgment this week?
Let's walk that line.
There'll just be like a night where it's just I'm just never on again, and no one will say anything, and it'll be like, well, you went too far.
Remember the first one when everyone was drinking?
I had a bourbon that night. I was nervous.
Good time. So let's see what we got. Let's give the people their secrets so we can go to bed.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a good one. What's a good one? Bear, any ideas? I'm sitting here thinking about it.
This is not a secret, but everyone should know this if they're watching this.
Here's some insider news. So,
Cloud Foundry Summit, real quick. Cloud Foundry Summit, May 11th and 12th.
Yeah.
It's out there.
Good one.
HP has never done Dojo yet. They've never sent people full-time to rotate through Dojo. And they wrote me for the first time today. I think they're getting more serious. Their Seattle engineering team wants to send someone through Dojo. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of contributions they make. That's first time they're stepping up to do that. So
yeah, that's really exciting. I mean, that's really important to call out. Like, you know, we've talked a lot about how Pivotal had success earlier this year, $40 million in business, and how IBM has really had a success with Bluemix. But we've got SAP and now HP actually sending people through, like, you know, working in the Pivotal offices on Cloud Foundry embedded with us. It's real, this collaboration between these companies.
I think that's one of the most amazing experiments about Cloud Foundry is the Dojo and the fact that for free you can basically, or you know, whatever the cost of your room and board in San Francisco, you can come work on these Cloud Foundry engineering teams. You know, from wherever you are, as long as you can. If you're tall enough to ride the ride, you could come to the dojo.
Yeah, I think the one other thing is that a top 3 in the world financial institution / bank, investment bank, I saw their foundation papers come across my desk. I'm pretty sure it's done.
You already tell people that a nation state joined the foundation?
A nation state that is south of North Korea has joined the foundation. That'll be coming. I won't say which nation state is south of North Korea. There's a lot of countries south of North Korea. And then a top 3 in the world financial institution has signed papers to join. So that's pretty cool. That's happening.
Yeah. So yeah, why pick one secret when you can have lots?
Yeah. Here's one more. You want to know a good one? This one's really top secret. We're gonna make our cloud free. So a lot of people don't know this, but we held back our Pivotal Web Services from being sold by our sales force, and we have an amazing thing that we're going to announce at the end of the month, where if you buy our software, you can run it for free on the hosted cloud for no additional cost. It'll be the first time anyone's ever done that. So I won't say anything more than that, but it's already blowing people's minds when they hear about it. So for anyone who tuned in for the whole hour and a half on Sunday night, you just got some of our best juice right there.
The Cloud Foundry juice.
Well, I mean, it's like, hey, the cloud's a commodity, so go with it. Make the cloud infrastructure free with your software. Like, the problem is that people have been taking the problem on the wrong way. They're like, oh, let's go get some on-demand VMs and then figure out some automation and middleware that happen to come with that. And you never want to get software as part of your hardware. That's just always a bad idea.
You're going to have a bad time.
A very, very, very bad time.
So with that, unless anyone else has something they want to say, I think we'll sign off. Until next time, Cloud Foundry After Dark.
Peace.
We keep it real.
Night all.
Cheers.